I'm hopeful that'll be available for all of us come our next gathering.
So one more question. I mean, Dana might know the answer to this too, and Kirk, you might. Are the grants available for that kind of infrastructure? Like
there are. So
in
part
ag,
of
there's the value-added grants.
That's right. So part of what I'm hoping will come out of these meetings and my site visits with folks and meeting with different people in the whole kind of chain of custody of the wood products industry here is enough interest and a core group of people that want to look at a local wood products production system here on the island, or on the islands plural, and then we can go to the USDA in particular, to some of the rural business development grants and get a much larger grant to look at feasibility studies, business planning, production efficiencies, product lines, markets, etc. That process has to be locally inspired, so there has to be people on the island that want to coordinate that. You know, I can come in and help bring some of the funding in, and then also help us with the market development on the mainland, which is going to be essential to making this work also. We won't be able to keep it all. Local markets alone, as Kai is indicating, won't support this. It's going to have to be a combination of local and off-island, and that's where I can help. So that's, I want everybody's feedback on that. If folks have resources, be it skill sets, equipment, again, timber, you know, what have you, that's what I need to hear, that there is interest in working on that. And again, out of these conversations, I'm hoping we'll get a core group of, you know, half dozen dozen people that we can start coordinating this with. I'll take one last question, then we are going to have to move on.
I know Rick Waldron on San Juans got a big commercial shop with a kiln and has all the equipment to make flooring.
Okay.
Our house has got his
It
floors
is.
in it.
Okay.
He actually did Bill Wolf's floor,
Yeah. So,
and there were issues with his machinery and the kiln. It's not yet viable on a commercial scale. As a very devoted, small scale, his operation has been very well known, well regarded. We ran into many technical problems. It was a large project. It was overwhelming for him on multiple levels, technologically as well, in terms of quality of product that came out. We had a lot of issues. There were a lot of expenses for the installation. Such great intentions, awesome guy, love him dearly, and we'll continue to use him, but that's, yes, a lot of questions out there, and I'm looking for resources, believe me. I'm passionate about this, and I'm very passionate about progression to bring this sustainability to the island.
Kai, just one thing, I don't quite get it. If you can get a molding machine for $20,000, that amortizes out to about $200 a month. Why can't you get one?
So Wally, let me. I'm going to enlarge. Let me enlarge the problem. It needs three-phase power, which is achievable. It needs a large, climate-controlled building to put it in. Once the product is produced, the wood chips which come out of this machine, planer chips, take a similarly expensive investment to handle them. Essentially, it's a vacuum system, a glorified, massive system to take this out. All achievable. Add another 20 grand. Add the building to it, whatever that cost may be. The further issue then comes to make an actual market for this wood on the island. Currently, I'm working in a broker position where there's a known purchaser, and I put the package together, and once it's processed, it immediately goes to the home site where it's then installed by the contractor. If we come into a larger operation where I'm trying to promote retail sales, now I need a facility climate controlled, not too fancy, but it can't just be an open shed where we store these materials, and they are kept at kiln dried 6%, 7% moisture content. So there's two buildings involved. Or a very large building with separate barriers, if you will, separate components.
Let's talk after.
I would love to. I need some real estate to put these structures on. I'm
He's
sorry.
the man to talk to.
I know, Wally, thank you for being here. Great questions, and it's beyond today's scope.
It is.
I'm a sideline, and I'm gonna step out.
Again, the fourth meeting is really intended to get at what are those barriers. I mean, we want to bring in the wood more of the wood products, the end users, the architects, builders, as well as the manufacturers, to have that discussion of what are the barriers to making this happen. And hopefully then out of that final meeting, we'll have a core group of folks that are interested in working on this. I and my organization can go and get additional funding to work with you all on really trying to break down some of those barriers. So yeah, we're gonna leave that topic for the moment here. This morning is, again, we want to focus on silviculture. So with that rough segue, I want to introduce Carson Sprenger with Rainshadow Forest Consulting. Carson is based here in East Sound. He's forestry consultant across all the San Juan Islands, and really is your local expert in forest ecology and silviculture. So I've asked Carson to come and talk for a little over an hour or so, again, about different forest management strategies that can be applied to different forestry scenarios on the island. Hopefully you'll be able to identify with each of the scenarios that he brings up. We'll take about a 10-minute break when Carson's done, and then we'll have Rich Harvey with Harvey Logging come up. He's going to talk in detail about logging logistics, costs, revenue, barriers to on-island viability, what it means to export logs off the island, etc. So hopefully by the time these two guys are done, you're going to have a very clear sense of both what the opportunities are for you to do a commercial timber sale and also what some of the challenges are. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Carson, and
Yeah, thanks, Kurt.
okay.
Yeah, go ahead. And this is my pitch for my business, quickly here. My wife and I started Rainshadow Consulting in 2005, shortly after we finished graduate school, and we moved to Shaw in 2007, began our business out of our home, and then recently in September moved to Orcas. And we do both consulting and some limited contracting. Primarily the consulting focuses on forestry and conservation-based work. We'll do county and state compliant forest management plans, inventory, your volume of your stands, harvest permitting, habitat restoration, and any number of forest health or tree assessments. The contracting side, we do have 2 full-time employees that work primarily with pre-commercial thinning, tree planting, arborist hazard tree removal, and some restoration work as well. 4 general areas I'm going to cover is, quickly I want to review what we talked about in the last workshop, get folks up to speed. I want to delve a little bit into my research in fire history, give a little context when we discuss stand types, and also to show people a little bit about the methodology of that type of ecological inquiry. The meat of the talk is focusing on a general suite of stand types and a general suite of management options that are appropriate for those stand types, and lots of photos and examples and a few questions. This was what we really covered the last time. We couched it as principles of ecological forestry, and number 1 is essentially do no harm. Don't make things worse. Your soil is probably your most valuable asset. Retain interesting ecological features that are long-lived and difficult to replace, i.e. old-growth trees and snags, and protect rare species. That's the conservation element. Know your forests and access. I emphasized that quite a bit last time. I hope that some of you were there. Got a chance to go out and spend some time in your woods and understand what constraints to access you may have. If you can't get to it, how can you really manage it? How do you know what's there? And essentially we talked about how to improve things. Most of us, we could find an opportunity to improve the condition or the quality of timber on our site, and that should be a driving focus with ongoing management. And the all-importance of planning. You need to spend some time forecasting what your options are and getting a sense of what you would likely do in the future, right? That's the plan. Okay, so this was my master's research, and my field site was on Waldron Island, and I looked at the ecological history of fire. So why would you want to do that? Roughly 75%, 3/4 of our forest, being San Juan Islands, were maintained to some level by fire. Fire fundamentally affects the structure. When we say structure, that's sort of the physical composition, the layout, the horizontal, the vertical, the orientation of trees and the density. And the composition, that's the suite of species that occupy site. And finally, understanding patterns of fire, certainly with frequency and extent, help us better understand current forest conditions. That's the real important one. The objectives of the study were to investigate the fire history of Waldron, specifically to document the frequency and variability of historic fires, and evaluate the extent, the size. So, if you're familiar with Waldron Island, if you don't know where San Juan Islands are, there you go. The red triangles are my sample trees. It was a 400-acre site. I would say on average dry. Dominant forest type was Douglas fir with scattered oak and madrone. Sampling methods. We removed 29 either partial cross sections. This is taking a sample of an old growth tree without cutting it down. You take a wedge-shaped sample, and down logs we took full cross sections. And some of these trees were about 400 to 500 years old. Oh, and that, yeah, sorry. So this is really what you're after here. This is the record captured in the annual rings. And this is a sample that shows repeated, frequent, returning fire, right? So it actually will kill cambium in a portion of the tree and record that in the annual rings.
How do you know that's not lightning, or is that the same thing?
You can rule out lightning a number of ways. And really what I was after was, I mean, I don't know if you could, a lightning strike on an individual tree probably doesn't create a scar like that. But a lightning strike could initiate a fire and start a fire. And we didn't really look at ignition sources, we just looked at evidence of fire. An ignition source came later. So all of these samples had to be sanded down to very fine level. Scars were identified under the microscope, and dates were assigned and verified through a method of cross-dating, because we really wanted annual resolution.
So is that an 1842 fire?
Yes. Yep. So I boiled it down. This is kind of the end, but this is a weighty slide here. This is the fire history. So here we have time, all the way up to 2002, I guess, was the end of the study. These red lines represent individual samples, and these correspond to a dated fire event. So our analysis really began in 1700 when we had sufficient samples to do some statistical analysis. And these, you can see when they line up, as many of them do, that indicates a fire that occurred or was recorded across a broader section of landscape, not an individual point. Advance the slide once. Yeah. So does that make sense, folks? And so these are the individual samples, right? And this is when they came into be a datable sample. And this, what we just highlighted was we called the historic period. So on Waldron, that's up to 1880. That's essentially corresponds to when Waldron was actively settled, and we kind of called that, pre-settlement period. And if we look at that landscape and we calculate the mean fire return interval, it's about every 7.5 years, right? So then advance the slide again, please. And now we have from about 1880 up to present. Now, one of the first things I hope you'll notice is that hasn't been a fire on that landscape since I think it was 1908. It's 105 years.
What about the lime kiln fuel issue?
So Say again?
The lime kiln fuel issue.
Lime kiln fuel issue.
Much of the islands were.
Oh, logged, right,
Yeah.
thank you. Not on Point Disney.
Okay.
Too inaccessible, too difficult. There was some grazing, and there was a little bit of logging. But primarily there was a lack of ignition. We had fuel, but we had lack of ignition. So I guess the focus, part of the emphasis is that during the historic period we had very frequent fire. Essentially over the last 100 years, very infrequent to no fire. And I can also tell you on Waldron there was really no way to suppress fires. This is a very inaccessible part of the island. People don't go out there and put out fires with a truck. They just don't. Right? So, last slide on fire. Historic fires burned at least 7.5 years. Current fire-free period is the longest in at least 500-year period, probably several thousands of years. Returning fire to the landscape, if we want to do that, could pose a major challenge. We have a very different set of fuel conditions, a different set of landscape issues complicated with housing, etc. Fire or a fire surrogate, that is some management action that can do the same thing as fire, may be needed to ensure long-term forest health. So the last question I have is, anyone have any clues about the ignition source? How are these fires started?
Native Americans through that current.
Yeah, that's kind of what we inferred. We knew there was Native Americans out there, and lo and behold, around 1880, 1900, most of the seasonal natives that were there left or got pushed off or got sick and tired. So without that human source, there were no fires, or very few.
Can't hear you.
You can't hear me. I'm sorry. I'll try to speak louder. Okay, let's move on. So I'm going to talk about young stands that are typical of the San Juan Islands. I'm going to talk about mature stands, and then we're going to talk about kind of old growth like stands. And for young stands, I'm saying 5 to about 40 years old. This is where you typically get high tree density, low understory development. Once you advance the slide, there we go, some more photos here. You've probably seen some examples of this. We have very high tree establishment rates, exceptionally dense. This is on the edge of a Gary Oak meadow. Okay, here's another, maybe kind of a little bit older, younger stand, if you will. A little bit of developed understory, but really we have as a single age class, very uniform, tight spacing. This is an unmanaged stand, Stewart. Yeah, hit this.
Question, that round, that he sent around, it was 100
Right.
years old,
Yes.
or about that size, so you kind of
Yeah.
have to core them to know really
You
what
do.
age.
Sure, yeah, this is, this is probably older than 60 years old. So that 5 to 40 is, is kind of is an attempt to get at the age, but really what we're talking about is the structure of the forest. So characteristics, typically single age class, you really just have one age of tree, low structural diversity, it's fairly simplified, sparse understory, and unmanaged, we have certainly very high stocking levels, and also I've seen examples of, in an unmanaged sense, very low stocking levels, and this is something I'll return to where the effects of browse primarily has damaged a lot of young stands and left them understocked. So the main management option, if you will, in these young, I'd say simplified or poorly developed stands is a non-commercial or pre-commercial thin. We mentioned this. So, and the primary objective is to reduce density, open the stand up. Oftentimes is to shift species mix to come up with a more desirable species mix. If we have, for example, grand fir or hemlock in a site that's prone to drying, they're not going to last long, live a long time or a long term. So with the pre-commercial thin, you're going to get few usable products. It's typically going to be out-of-pocket expense. These are small trees. You might get some fuel wood. You might get some chips. pre-commercial thin for most of the stands around here. I would recommend a double entry. Sometimes a single entry can be sufficient, spaced apart, maybe 5 to 10 years. Your first entry might be at about 15 to 20 years age. Another one along at 20 to 25 years. Those aren't hard and fast rules. Oftentimes, it's going to be an out-of-pocket improvement type expense, you can combine that with road improvements, improve your access, and sometimes targeted planting.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
What do you mean by entry?
So
You mean planting?
that would be an operation. That's when you move
Okay.
people or equipment in.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, don't feel shy about shouting that out. Questions? Yeah. Does that make sense?
I just want to throw something out, and it's, Kirk kind of brought up a broader issue, which is, you know, you're talking about timing varies, and you're talking about 15 to 20 years, 20 to 25 years. We don't need to deal with this today, but there really needs to be some education of our elected officials, the assessor, our council members,
Yeah.
because they're the ones who are reviewing these forest management plans.
Right.
And I've had several of them say, there's no management going, there's no harvest happening because the timeline, they don't understand it. And it's gonna have really, I think, dire implications
Yeah.
for our forest
If there was
lands.
a bottom line, it would be every site is a little bit different. Every site needs to have its own timeline, really. But yes, you have a
But
good point.
they just don't understand this longer term,
Right.
kind of management.
true. I just talked to them the other day.
One other issue is the conservation easements of the trust and the land bank. You wanna make sure they work within these parameters as well.
Yeah.
And they need to be educated as well.
Yeah. Go ahead. Okay, thank you. So now we're moving into mature stands. So by mature, I'm talking about stands that are a little bit older, are showing some complexity. They are you're typically going to have increases in volume and increases in productivity, and improved timber quality. Now, Kai brought in some samples that were not a particularly big tree, but it had some really valuable qualities to it. And in some ways, this might be the sweet spot. You know, the trees are not too large to deal with. They have fewer defects in some ways, and they will benefit from selective removal in some ways, as we'll see. So the development phase that's important here is called stand reinitiation. That's the development of your next stand. That's trees that are regenerating naturally as these stands open up and create a little growing space. And an unmanaged mature stands, they can be still very dense with suppressed growth and low vigor. So here's some photos. This is a pretty nice looking stand. As you can see, both on the left and the right and sort of down in the stand, we have young trees that have naturally regenerated. These are shade tolerant trees. I believe there's cedar and some hemlock. They're able to come up through the relatively dense shade that the overstirred Douglas fir is casting. And we also have a little bit of downwood and probably a few snags in there that increases the complexity, adds a little habitat value. We also have a fair amount of volume from decently merchantable trees. Here's another photo showing that second age class, or that younger shade tolerant trees coming up through a single age Douglas fir stand. And slide, yep. This is a cedar stand, I would say in that sort of mature class as well. Cedar is a little more shade tolerant, but there will go through a period where it casts a lot of shade and won't have that development. Here it's beginning to show signs of maturity. So,
Let me go
no,
back
that's
one.
fine, yep. So, when we're talking about mature stands, most management actions now include commercial harvest. That's kind of what we're talking about. When we manipulate them, there is almost always a product that could be used, either through fuel wood or merchantable timber, etc. Here's my first extra credit question. So because cutting trees creates growing space, alters the direction or trajectory of stand development. Harvesting should always be supported by the
Forest plan.
harvest plan. That's pretty good.
Succession?
A little bit broad. I'm gonna pick on Dave.
I'd say the planning of the next generation.
Great one. Yeah, hit the slide button. Yeah, you got it. Essentially, we really need to be thinking about what's coming next. There's a little, there's regeneration plan. So, this is the opportunity to think about the future stand, the young members of that next age class. And it's an opportunity not to miss. To pick on Dave a little bit more, this is a picture from Blakely. And this was, I would say, a well-intentioned, moderate to heavy commercial thin with some unintended regeneration. That is, the plant at Douglas Fir got heavily browsed. It's a very difficult setting. And we have a heavy flush of a species that is not so desirable on the site, and that's Western hemlock. So it just gives you a sense of unintended consequences, right? So there's about 5 management options that I've included in our silvicultural toolkit or forest management toolkit. And they all relate to taking out harvestable trees. Now the first one is thinning from below. That gets thrown around a lot. Who has a good understanding of that without reading the text? Anyone? Raise your hand. Does the thinning from below make sense? Have you heard of it? Somebody's heard of it. Anybody? No? Okay. Well, when we say below, we mean the bottom of the diameter range, right? So if we go out and measure all the trees, there's going to be a range. We're talking about the smallest trees. We're focusing on the smallest trees. And by doing that, we're taking out the weak, the slow-growing, but also trees that are competing with the bigger members of the stand. And we're going to concentrate growth and vigor on the larger, more productive members of the stand. So it is the opposite, or the inverse, of high grading. Now that should be familiar to some of you folks. Who's heard of high grade harvest? I see hand in front, hand in back. Can anyone put that in a nutshell and why that was done? In fact, it's probably the most common style of harvest we've had in our county.
Money.
Yeah, you're picking the low-hanging fruit. So and essentially you're taking the biggest, the most merchantable trees and ignoring the rest. And there's lots of reason for that, but it has consequences in the quality and the trajectory of your stand. Thinning from below, and exactly why the opposite was done, is you typically get a small return or no return. You're taking out the least valuable trees, the smallest trees. You may be improving things and setting yourself up for the next round, but it's oftentimes an out-of-pocket or no return. Enter in thinning from across the diameter distribution. It's a more flexible approach. You're able to do some stand improvement, but select trees from that larger diameter class that are more merchantable, have more volume in them. It opens up more canopy space. You have to be aware of that in terms of your regeneration of your younger cohorts. And typically you're going to get a better return. You're just going to have more stuff to market. Variable density thinning is offered up oftentimes in really homogeneous stands that have very few habitat features or openings. It's designed to mimic natural forest gaps, be they from wind or insects or disease, and to add structural diversity to the stand. It's also somewhat flexible. You're going to increase complexity in habitat diversity, etc. Number 4, single tree selection is an old approach to forestry. Came about in hardwood forests and is probably appropriate for a shade-tolerant species or stand like cedar. So you really are kind of high grading in a sense. You are taking a large, robust, very merchantable species, individual, and you're creating growing space for a number of smaller individuals, but you are sort of taking the larger trees. So it would be a challenge to incorporate that in the Douglas fir stand, but something like cedar or a hemlock stand would be very appropriate. The fifth one is what we call patch cut, or you could say a small scale appropriate clear cut. And what we're talking about is harvesting a patch or a zone somewhere between 1/10 of an acre, which is about 70 feet in diameter, if you looked at a circle, to about 2 acres in size. There are examples where you could go beyond that, a little bit larger, with the idea that you want to bring in light or replace a patch of poorly formed trees. You're really going to be opening up a lot of canopy space. Sometimes when you have an alder stand that is reaching maturity, beginning to show signs of decay and mortality, and you want to capture that value, alder doesn't respond well to thinning, you may just cut that entire patch. Does that make sense?
I don't get the difference between 2 and 3.
2 and 3.
Variable density and
Variable
across.
density, yeah. And 3, sorry, what was 2 again? 2 was
Across the diameter.
across the diameter. So what you're, if you did it across the diameter thin, you might still implement it fairly uniformly across the landscape to achieve a certain average density throughout. And variable density, you're looking at a really homogeneous stand. You're saying, I want to develop some gaps or leave some patches of very thick trees for a particular habitat feature. And oftentimes, given our varied topography and just the nature of our landscapes, you can try to do an evenly applied thinning, but it's going to essentially be a variable density thinning. There are areas that are inaccessible, topography can be challenging, so there are a lot of similarities.
Can I ask one quick question?
Yeah.
And I'm sorry to go back to your thesis, but
Yeah.
there was something bothering me in that picture in that time period.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Why, if those fires occurred on an average every 7 years, why weren't more trees killed? Why wasn't the tree?
Excellent question.
They weren't huge.
Yeah.
They were
Yeah,
meant
I've
for
got
the
a
garden.
section
Oh, you do?
in mine too, so
Okay.
touch on as much
Yeah,
as you want.
yeah,
I'll
yeah.
touch
Well,
on too.
really quickly, the more frequent fires you have, the less fuel you have, because it consumes the readily consumable fuel, if you will, but then it comes back in 7 years and you have not time enough to grow big flammable stuff. So yeah,
So it moves through quicker.
it moves through quicker, lower intensity. Yeah.
I'll have some slides on that. It'll explain a little bit.
Sorry, I was just bugging
Yeah.
you.
No,
Couldn't
excellent,
figure it out.
excellent. Okay, so here's a recent commercial harvest that, in some ways, it's a great one for your question there. This was thin from below primarily, but it ended up being somewhat variable density just because the way it was implemented. It was shovel logged, and so you needed to have corridors to get that stuff out.
It's like a Bill
And the
Carlson.
topography was a bit challenging. It doesn't, well, yeah, it doesn't look particularly aesthetically pleasing, but they achieved a reduction in density, and actually they took out the poor qualities of the stand. So what you're not seeing here is all the really rough stuff that was there prior to the harvest. So they didn't have a lot of great, well-formed trees to begin with, but they did conduct a stand improvement. This is a couple before and after. This is a very dense, almost pure Douglas fir stand, where average tree density was sort of, diameter was like in the 6 to 8. And there are a few sizes, 11, maybe 12. Very dense, very suppressed, and a pretty weak, low vigor stand. So you hit the after. And
So
there's
go
the
back.
after. Yeah, you can go back and forth if you want, a couple times. Sure.
So some of that doesn't look like Doug fir to me, is it?
It's Doug fir that's very slow growing, so you get smoother bark. Yeah, it's all Doug fir.
Alright.
So they can see the after, and you can actually see behind the green trees the amount of light that comes through the sky. That we opened, the canopy space was opened up probably by about 15 or 20%.
Is Dolphin Bay?
Yes.
Right on.
Yeah. And the next slide.
Was there any value that came out of that one?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yep. Hit the
High
next slide.
value.
High value.
So this is the sort, right? So this is the main landing area. Primarily what came out of there, about 4 to 1 or 5 to 1, was pulp grain logs. They were really too small to run through a sawmill. The sawmills wouldn't take them. Firewood or pulp logs. And in this particular operation, the pulp market was very soft. It did pay for the trucking, and the landowner netted about $50 a load. So, but that, one load out of every 5 did go to the sawmill. Some of it was used locally on Orcas, and this stuff did bring some return to the landowner. But primarily, this was a thin from below stand improvement style harvest, working with a very difficult stand. That is, trees were by and large very small, very suppressed.
Has anybody worked with the chipping value of chipping, like the small stuff, low grade stuff?
As chips?
As chips, because I think there's a real need for
It could be. It's a real variable market. Yeah.
Ask that
Rich
question
will
on
talk
the
about
fall.
that. Yeah.
I'll help a lot of your economics questions
Yeah.
as Carson goes through.
But that was an out-of-pocket. I guess my emphasis, that was an out-of-pocket expense. So timing, this slide addresses timing, when to conduct a commercial thin. Essentially, you want to get there before trees begin to slow and lose vigor and lose crown, before overcrowding. When trees lose more than 2/3 of their live crown, there's sort of that 1/3, 2/3 rule. This is a very simplified graphic. These trees have about half of their crowning live foliage. The far tree over there has, well, maybe 20%. So that's, if the average members of your stand have 20% live crown, you're really showing the need to thin it, to open it up, to increase vigor. Timing or frequency, usually at, I'd say, 20 to 25 years would maybe be your first commercial thin on some sites, and an average cycle maybe every 8 to 15 years you need to come back. It's site-specific. Timing thinning is an art. And more often and less intensively equals greater resistance to wind flow. And that's a factor that shouldn't go underestimated on many of our island sites. Yep.
What are the advantages and disadvantages of opening the canopy?
Well,
Would you repeat the question?
yeah, advantages and disadvantages of opening the canopy. It really,
Opening the canopy.
to answer that, you need to talk about the condition of the stand. Say we're talking about an overcrowded stand. If you over thin or you take too much material, over open the canopy, you are setting yourself up from losses to wind throw, and maybe a flush of undesirable regeneration. If you really open up that canopy, you might get establishment of hemlock or grand fir or something you don't want. Or you can have a big catastrophic loss due to a bunch of wind throw. The advantages are you're increasing growing space, you're taking some material out that's hopefully useful, you're improving vigor and lowering competition. So I don't like to use this analogy. It's overly simplified, but think of thinning your carrots in your garden or something like that. There's a time and you have a window to get in there and manipulate that growing space to where you get that sweet spot of increased growth and vigor without getting the weeds.